You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here discussing a strange book, Herds. A book that may not even be a murder mystery, but on our Murder Mystery World Tour plants itself suspiciously at the tail end of our latest stretch of metafiction. That book is Death on the Seaside by Alison Moore. We are talking chapters 1 to 6, or part 1 of the book, and Herds.
Yeah, it's a very convenient book, actually. I liked it. We got 3 weeks to go through, and there are 3 parts. It's like it was written for us.
It's like it was made for us. I want to be very clear that
what?
I was struggling to pick a book to follow our latest stretch of metafiction because there's so many weird and interesting things going on, and I wasn't really sure who had inspired who in an interesting way that we could follow on. And then Alex Pavesi's blog came onto my radar, and it mentioned Death and the Seaside. And I remembered seeing it earlier this year when I was reading Jessica O's Cold Enough for Snow with the recommendation of Final Draft's Andrew Popel. And I went over to my favorite website for reading reviews of books and laughing at how laughable they are. And the top review said, DNF, 31%. This book is dreadfully boring.
Terrible.
And the second review said, 5 stars. This spellbinding psychodrama full of literary illusion and symbolism draws on many influences. Do not be fooled by its deceptively simple writing style. And I thought, that's it.
Goodness.
It's perfect. I love it already.
It has to be.
Let's go.
It's divisive. Look, those are the kind of books I love covering on the show. The books where we're like, this could be your favorite book, or you might throw it into the sea. That might happen.
Yeah.
That might be the end of your relationship with this book, but you don't know until you pick it up and actually go through it and actually finish the book. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, this came out in 2016, and it basically follows 2, 3 women?
4?
Bonnie and her landlady, Sylvia Slythe, make up one part of the story where they discuss the struggles of Bonnie's life and particularly her inability to finish writing fiction.
Yeah, so far that's the majority of the story, but as you point out, there is another half, and that's the story of Susan, who lives by the sea, is probably dead.
That's Herd's edition. The book does not mention she's dead.
It does open with her feeling like she's dead and having to like massage the blood back into her leg of lamb legs, or however they put it, her like muttonous legs. Look, it made me very hungry is what I'm saying at the start of this book. But yeah, look, I was not expecting this to be a proper metafiction where like one character's writing another character. But there seems to be some layers of deception in this book. There's some layers of, what does Susan represent to Bonnie? And will Bonnie ever learn to love writing in the way that she clearly wants to love writing? And I think that's really great. I really resonated a lot with this book so far, and this narrative about like parental expectations and she's also just really living it up in the rental crisis, which is fantastic. It's very #relatable.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that this is framed as either a book about the relationship between Bonnie and Susan or the relationship between Sylvia and Bonnie. Whilst obviously in the metafictional sense, the answer is it one of these two? The answer is yes, it's going to be about both of those relationships. But the way that it sort of divides them, where Susan becomes an unreal character when Sylvia is talking about her, but is a real character when Bonnie is talking about her. One of the strangest chapters in this book so far, chapter 5, is basically Sylvia stealing Bonnie's academic research into the ocean and recounting it to you.
Sylvia's she's such a funny one because she comes in as a predator.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure Bonnie just says like she looked like she was sizing me up like a meal, like it's a whole thing.
Like she's the landlady.
At first it's like she's gonna get you, but then they sit down and they have a kind of awkward cup of tea, and then they have another cup of tea together, this time with sugar and milk, because Sylvia brings the sugar and milk, and so you're thinking, oh, maybe she's not so bad. Maybe she's not like an awful, horrible lady. But then, of course, the book reveals that the landlady has a key to everything, and she's been snooping in Bonnie's stuff and taking her notes and her research and her books. And she says, oh, Bonnie, I think I knew your mother.
Yeah.
Yes, Pearl. That sounds like the day. I don't believe her for a second.
You don't believe her. I don't believe her for
really
a second.
Interesting. I'm not even dealing with this. I don't like Sylvia. She can suck a lemon. I'm so worried. Like, she's playing psychologist here, but I just don't like her very much.
The thing that was fascinating to me about that particular claim that she knew her mother was that the parallel to me was obviously meant to be the author-character relationship between Bonnie and Susan paralleled in the parental relationship that you were talking about in Parental Expectations. And I felt like I trusted Sylvia, but I felt that parental connection there where she still is imposing expectations that don't necessarily treat Bonnie fairly. I believed her, but I believed her in the sense that you would believe a parent who is saying, "Oh, I just always do right by my child." I'm like, "Yeah, sure you do."
But let's be clear. If
I'm sure you're perfect.
Yeah, let's be very clear. If she does, like, if she ever did know, Bonnie's mother, and she's using this as a way to like get into Bonnie's life more than she's using it as like, oh, I'm genuinely like interested as to how you're like. I don't know how things have turned out, I guess. I don't trust her intentions.
That's one of the reasons that Chapter 5 is so interesting, is because it's Sylvia recounting Bonnie's academic research as though it's academic research about Bonnie, as though she is a thing to be studied.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see where Sylvia goes as a character and how she kind of does things and affects Bonnie, because she's playing she's playing herself as a kind of a psychologist, right? Like, she's saying, oh, so Bonnie, why do you keep writing about all of these accidents and like people's limbs going dead? Why is that a thing?
Yeah.
And Bonnie's like, I don't know, I just do. And she's like, well, there must be some sort of underlying psychological phenomenon. She's like trying to act like she's not threatening at all, but she's clearly also trying to dig into these underlying feelings that Bonnie has, right?
Yeah, and I mean, when we get to the mystery side of things, which we'll obviously do in the back part of the show today, I think that's clearly where the biggest question for you is right now, Herds, is what the hickety heck is Sylvia up to or going to get up to that is going to like drive the conflict in this novel?
Yeah, look, I'm very curious to see what kind of chaos an old lady who runs a rental flat can get up to. Look, I'm very excited.
I think the other thing that's fascinating character-wise in this book is obviously going to be Susan, who is kind of a condensed version of Bonnie. Like, Susan is Bonnie's middle name in many ways.
She's the core of her. Oh.
Yes, Susan is presented as an opposite to Bonnie, and in many other ways is presented as a direct parallel. Like, Bonnie lives as far inland as is basically possible on Slash Lane.
Yes.
Because we got to have something weird and zany in our crime novels.
They even draw attention to it. They're like, yeah, Slash Lane, it'll be fine.
Several times. It's kind of bizarre.
And I'm like, what are you doing? You crazy.
Susan lives by the sea.
Yeah. I mean, we have very little, we know very little about her, I guess. We know that she like lives in an apartment with no curtains. She refuses the job to work in the tiny, like, carnival cellar space, whatever it is. And so in some ways, she's kind of a wish fulfillment for Bonnie, where, like, she wishes she didn't have to work in the cleaning job that she has at the arcade. We're shown the story before Bonnie moves into her new place and gets her new job.
I feel like the expectation is that has to be important because, like, for example, in The Woman in the Library, we saw Leo's letters before we saw anything else in that story.
Yeah, because it's not a story that she's written before moving, because chapter 2 is all about her move.
Yes.
Maybe I'll have to check some of the language in there and the tenseness of it, but it is interesting that we're being presented with, this is what Susan's life is like. And now this is how Bonnie's life reflects the story that she has written in the past, which is a bit of an interesting switcher.
Well, yeah, and it's also bizarre how specific the setting that Susan lives in is. Like, we get to hear about very particular signs, very particular places that she's going.
Sure.
Like, the framing, the setting of Susan is almost as important in many ways so far as her actual narrative.
I don't know about the scenery, but I know that when I was reading through it, there were like 3, and there are probably more, but there were 3 explicit methods of death that were called out. She goes and stands on the balcony and she thinks about falling, and she remembers how her mother said that if she ever were to fall out of the window, she'd be lucky if only her legs were broke. The idea of like being paralyzed is important, or having your legs injured is important.
There is a lot of that sort of stuff, and like I think the curious thing for us is that normally the format on the show is to talk a little bit about where the plot's going, what we think of what the characters are doing. And to sum up this segment so far, Herds, I think, would you agree so far that nothing has happened?
I mean, we've moved into an apartment and we've talked about books for like an hour.
Yeah.
That's what's happened, which is fine.
That's page one of most of the sorts of books that we would cover on this show dealing with similar subject matter.
Yeah, it is very slow. Well, this is, and look, I have very little experience with this kind of books. I don't read a lot of books where we just kind of experience what it is like to be a person in a space. The section that kind of piqued my interest is when we're talking about Bonnie's authorship, and she's talking about all the like help books that she's got about like how to write. And the entire point of this section of paragraphs is her reading these books on how to write and going, this doesn't make any sense to me. Like, what do you mean I live in the same world as my characters? What do you mean that they're like real people? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas that's the kind of book that we're reading. Like, she's just framed as the kind of person who wouldn't at face value understand a book like this, at least not wholly, I suppose. She's kind of framed to be someone who isn't in on the joke, although she is a very earnest author, and her writing is, very important to her.
Yeah.
She's not as academic as other people might be, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that is a fantastic point. I think we should probably close this little box up here. Hit the music.
And open another box.
And we will be back with more on Death in the Seaside when we return for the mystery section at the end of the show. Herds, I hope you're prepared.
Yeah, sure.
This is
super ready.
This is Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour here on 2SER 107.3. We'll be back with more of Alison Moore's Death and the Seaside in just a second. You're listening to Death of the Reader, Flex here with you, and I wanted to talk with you about a little experience that's been happening here in Sydney over the start of this year. It is the Murder at Elizabeth Bay House. It's a little interactive murder mystery event put on by Fever, which is an events company. And a few nights out of the year, the next one's on in June, you can be a guest at Elizabeth Bay House to investigate the death of Sir Sid Nee. I was recommended this event by Catherine Depulou-Menager of Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival, and so I grabbed a couple of friends, went on down for the evening, and tried to see if my books-related murder mystery expertise could hold me sway in whatever this would be.
Sir Sid Nee was such a great benefactor to everyone until he was murdered 2 weeks ago outside by his butler, the conniving little scamp. Thankfully, he's very much in jail.
With that butler very much in jail, you're invited round for the reading of the will. And who was that you heard talking just then?
I am Nimrod Nomos, master detective of the Kyrgyzstan Cavalry. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is there a detective in the Kyrgyzstan Cavalry? Well, in Kyrgyzstan, 2 out of every 3 crimes is committed by a horse.
But nonetheless, you and your fellow partygoers to this will reading are set to enjoy a fine evening, awaiting the spoils of wealth that you are just about to come onto, along with whatever strange investigation Nimrod Nomos is carrying out. When you first arrive at the house, you'll be greeted by the leader of one of 6 teams. From what I hear, they spice this up a little bit each time, but for us, the groups were the artists, the entrepreneurs, the equestrians, the politicians, the psychics, and the scientists. You're given an identity as a member of one of these teams. For example, I was an animal rights activist.
But I mean, in the course of our work, we all, get our hands dirty from time to time, don't we? It's just a part of the job. Animal rights advocate. I mean, I'm sure this week alone there's been the odd misdemeanor you've committed.
That dealing with Thomas Edison, it was completely above board. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
I was on the politicians team, in case you couldn't tell.
The nerve of you, sir. The nerve!
And then over the course of the evening, you'll learn a little bit more about the death of Sir Sidney and what perhaps each of the teams had to do with that death. Why investigate, though? What if your leader is guilty? Well, don't worry. There is, behind all of this, a fictional financial incentive.
That's not the only way that you will earn money by detecting who the crimes are committed by. You will also earn loads of money by interacting with the other leaders and playing their games and activities. That's where the real cash is. So, trust no one. Find out what happened, but most of all, have fun.
So through the hour and a half that you were there at Elizabeth Bay House, you've got perhaps 45 minutes, maybe a little less, to actually wander about, speak with all of the different characters, and find out the clues for whichever part of the crime you are assigned in your group. I really like this setup, the way that we're put into teams, the strong characters and big speeches that everyone gives on the way in created a wonderful atmosphere. And it is at this point, of course, that we get into the actual puzzle. And no spoilers. There are a select few questions that every team has to answer, and with about 20 people per team, just a portion of that team is allocated to each question, so you won't get to work on the entire puzzle yourself and will have to rely on your teammates. The actual play of the game is going about to each of the guild leaders and participating in these little mini-games that they have, each in different parts of Elizabeth Bay House.
Now, there are two ways we're celebrating Jeebus. What would you like to play?
Play a risky game.
Risky game roulette, I like it. Good luck to all of you.
You're playing these mini-games to gather money for your team, as the Lord Mayor mentioned earlier. And while you're playing these games, you have small opportunities to interact with members of the cast, to ask them various questions about the day of the crime. These interactions were the best part. The actors do such a wonderful job with all of these little riffs on whatever terrible improv you approach them with.
I have royal blood. I have a secret brother as well.
Precisely. I thought a man of your stature would.
As it happens, I think I lost my brother. So if you would find me another man who looked exactly like me, I would appreciate this very much. Thank you very much. Because I'm royalty too.
Going into the full theatre and performance and attempting to act alongside professional actors isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I certainly think there was room for a little bit more, and I think that was my biggest criticism of the evening overall. There just wasn't enough time to get to be a part of the story so much as just tag along for it. I don't know how feasible it would be to get a smaller group of people rather than the 100 or so, but at $60 a head, I would hope that that would be an option. And I think would have really leaned into the strengths of the cast that they had there for the evening.
Now, with regards to the other small matter this evening, that of the murder, we remember?
Now, if you've ever done interactive mystery evenings before, you'll know that they have to be a little bit accessible, and I would call this one closer to the beginner-friendly side of things. I felt like there was one particular trick that was overused for each of the little parts of the puzzle that had to be solved. I suppose I can appreciate that that's good because you wouldn't want to be allocated to a less interesting task, but it does mean that the culmination of things feels a little anticlimactic. I guess to conclude what has apparently become a review, I really enjoyed this experience. I think there was lots of room for very obvious improvement, and I certainly would have liked to see either a lower ticket price or fewer people there for the evening so that you could get a bit more depth out of it. But that said, a talented cast, a gorgeous location, and an accessible puzzle, more mystery events in Sydney, I really cannot complain that much. I just hope that they keep getting better. This is Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour here on 2SER 107.3. If you want to find out more about the murder at Elizabeth Bay House, we will have links up on the podcast. Let's jump back over to Death and the Seaside by Alison Moore. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here discussing Alison Moore's Death and the Seaside Part 1, which covers chapters 1 to 6. Herds is challenged with solving this murder mystery without a body, this crime fiction novel without a death, this conundrum without a puzzle. Herds, what's happening?
That's a great question. I'm not entirely clear what I'm meant to be solving here. As you say, there is no explicit puzzle. There is no explicit detective, although perhaps Sylvie would fit into that slot with the way that she's rifling through everyone's stuff, apparently, peeking into the lives of her tenants. My instinct out the gate is like, well, Susan's dead and Bonnie is coping with Susan's death and Bonnie is like trying to deal with the fact that she will eventually die. Like that's my assumption, that there was a traumatic event in the family past where this person named Susan, maybe where she got her middle name from. That would be my best guess. You know, this old smoky lady fell out of her window or maybe into the sea, broke her legs. And that's something that Bonnie is dealing with by writing stories about her.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bonnie puts it to paper. Then Sylvie finds the notes and goes, these are some interesting stories. They sound like that story of that Susan lady who ended up in the hospital. So yeah, I guess that's more or less what's going on. I feel like Sylvie is definitely the part that is most curious to me, because what is her motive for trying to like uncover this event and like make Bonnie remember or make Bonnie face whatever she did or didn't do, you know? Like, that's what I'm most curious about.
Well, yeah. I mean, you mentioned in the last section that there's the line where Sylvie is described as looking upon Bonnie as though
yes,
Little Red Riding Hood was being looked at by the wolf.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's where the challenge that I want to set you for this book lies. Is that obviously this is a book that's going to have a couple of little twists, couple of little reveals, couple of little spicy bits.
Catches you off guard sort of things, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, it's always going to be a bit of an impossible task to just say, like, spot 3 twists. Because what constitutes a twist? So what I would like from you, Herds, over the course of this book for your points is I would like you to link anything adjacent to a twist. With
anything adjacent to a twist.
Anything adjacent to a twist.
Okay.
With one of the like narrative devices like that Red Riding Hood comparison in the story.
Okay.
Obviously, the challenge in this is going to come down to largely how much you know about the texts being referenced. I'm more than aware of this, which is why the task is so broad and simple.
I'm just going to have to go read chapter 5 again.
Kind of.
Look,
I don't think that the points in this book are going to be a big deal or a big challenge, but I think there is a lot to interrogate about how it uses, you know, literary reference to establish things that are about to happen, and the way that works, because not every member of the readership of this book is necessarily going to know every example.
I mean, can I throw two at you right now? Two things that I've kind of noticed that I'm curious to see how they play in. So one of them, let's start with the Innsmouth question. Lovecraftian story. It's one of the stories referenced in chapter 5 as talk about the sea is it's slimy and scaly and all that sort of thing. And that's what Lovecraft does. He takes things that he doesn't understand and he goes, what is the creepiest way I can describe them without actually describing them, which is beautiful horror. But also Innsmouth is famous for being about Lovecraft's, I want to say, Irish heritage. And part of the reason why he's able to create such vivid descriptions of the horrors of the unknown is because what he's really grappling with is his racism.
Yeah.
His horrible, terrible racism. And it's one of those really interesting literary figures because he's so well regarded, but it all comes from a place of like confusion and disgust and hatred and like, It's wild. It's wild that Lovecraft was such a like terrible person, but his works are so like permeating in popular culture and ideas of horror that you can't just be like, well, he was a horrible racist. Let's just not use his work ever again or reference it ever again. It's just not possible.
Well, it's also interesting in the way that, going back to what we were talking about in the first section of the show today about sort of the othering of the two narratives between Bonnie and Sylvia and Bonnie and Susan, and how one of them becomes an unreal character in the other's narrative, is sort of feels a bit familiar to the way that other cultures are represented in stuff like Lovecraft, where it's so alien that it's not worth describing.
It's a really terrible way of putting it, but yeah, completely. And I think that the angle that I want to put here, the Lovecraft angle here, is that in the same way that Lovecraft's writing was dealing with the underlying feelings of his Irishness and how he was dealing with that, clearly Bonnie's writing is to deal with the underlying trauma that she feels. She's writing about the problems that other people have, that Susan has, because she doesn't know how to express her own disabilities or problems, that sort of thing.
I guess the other one that I wanted to ask about, which I think is kind of in that same discussion where Lovecraft is mentioned, is the lure of the sea.
Well,
The narrative of Susan is drawn to the sea, while Bonnie seems to be staying as far away from it as possible. What do you think that lure is?
well, the lure could mean two things, right? Like one is she's already dead, and we don't think too much more about it because she can't escape it because she's already passed on, man. The other one is that if she is a character who has become disabled and is not dealing with that very well, and she's smoking and she's in pain, it sounds like suicidal thoughts to me. Like that's the classic like lure of the sea. The sea is death. That's something that's like well established. Death in the seaside, and the seaside, the like stage that you play on, that is the beach. That is the step before the fourth wall is broken.
Yeah.
Before you move on to things that we don't know. Which means that the paper that Bonnie thinks she can't quite remember what was on it is probably like, you've got terminal cancer. Like that's probably what that paper is.
Yeah.
For all that smoking you were doing. Yeah. I do think it's kind of interesting that we don't talk about what's in the sea. The sea is like limitless and endless. In fact, the part that stuck out to me, and this is the second thing I want to draw attention to, is when we're talking about Sylvie's trying to interpret Bonnie's relationship with the sea.
Yep.
And she says, oh, you might get dragged underneath and like taken away completely by accident. But no, because what Bonnie is really drawing attention to is that someone might put you under, and that could be something that's exhilarating, something that can refresh you. You know, that near-death experience can be exciting. Like there's the saying that like the closer you are to death, the more you appreciate living. Right.
This is all fantastic. I love your thoughts, Herds. I love this idea of the book tackling like mortality, which it is obviously doing with the title, like Death and the Seaside.
Yeah, we're not sneaking anything past us. You know, I don't think that's the intention.
But I like the variety of extractions that you've managed to get out without kind of conflicting them. I think that's really fun because it's like. As one of the things that, as someone who enjoys solving puzzles in books, I really enjoy about literary texts is spotting all of these ridiculous overlaps and being like, maybe it does work.
Well, like I mean, at the end of the day, for like the mystery or whatever, I want to focus in on the concrete details of like the blank note, the light under the door, which we haven't even really talked. I don't know what to say about that. It's there. It's ominous. There's someone living.
Someone else in the building.
You know, it's probably Sylvie now that I think about it. It's probably Sylvie on the other side of the door.
It's not like a Monty Hall problem.
A Monty Hall problem where if you say you're gonna open the door, then Sylvie might be behind a different door.
Yeah.
But then it's actually just Monty Hall.
If you open the correct door, it's Susan behind there, and she was real all along.
Oh, she was real all along. That makes sense.
That's why you always got to always switch.
Yeah. So you got to switch. You got to find the Susan. Yeah. No, I think that the idea of Sylvie being behind that door and like poring over Bonnie's notes while she's asleep is kind of a fun idea literarily.
You never know. It could be the Innsmouth people living next door.
Look, it could be Chi, who I don't know where we want to slot these characters in, but there are other characters in the book.
There are a couple of other characters in the book, but calling them characters thus far is perhaps illustrious.
There's Chi, who works at the oh my goodness, the arcade.
Yes.
She's also a cleaner. And they have a moment where Chi and Bonnie are contemplating rebellion. But then Mr. Carr, the manager, walks up and he doesn't say anything, but his presence is enough to disperse them. And I thought that was really, really neat, in like a sad capitalist sort of way. So yeah, we don't know much about them, Chi the cleaner and Mr. Carr the manager, but I'm sure one of them's probably going to get killed. Let's be real. One of them's going to get pushed in a damn arcade machine.
Are you saying that Bonnie is actually the person who killed Susan and now she's going to kill someone else?
Maybe. Oh, is she the one who pushed? Did she push her under? Did she push Susan under?
You're listening to Death of the Reader.
She pushed her under.
We are discussing Alison Moore's Death in the Seaside, chapters 1 to 6. Flex and Herds.
She pulled the plug,
guiding you through this wonderful literary crime fiction crossover.
I'm so ready.
We will be back next week with part 2.
Euthanasia is a hot button issue. Let's go.
We'll be back back next week with part 2 on your Murder Mystery World Tour. This is 2SER 107.3. See you then.